So tonight we're delighted to be hosting a conversation between Dr. Katherine Hayhoe and Dr. Ruth Padilla DeBorst. And welcome to you both. It's wonderful to see you. You know each other, but this is the first time that I have met you. And I wonder, for the benefit of folks, there may be a few folks out there who've not come across your work before, and we hope this will reach lots of different corners. So could you just briefly introduce yourself and say what you do and where you're based? Ruth, can I start with you?
Sure. So I was born in Colombia, grew up in Argentina. I'm currently based in Costa Rica. And I'm involved in theological formation, leadership development across Latin America and beyond, around the world in different ways.
Thank you so much. And Katherine?
So I was born in Canada, spent a number of years as a child growing up in Colombia, and now I live in Texas, where I am a professor at Texas Tech University, and I am also the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, which is the biggest conservation organization in the world that works in over 70 countries across the planet. I'm a climate scientist, which means that I study climate change. Specifically, I study what happens in the places where we live in ways that matter to us. So I don't study the ice sheets or the polar bears. I study our food, our health, our water, our cities, and especially how climate change affects people who are already marginalized and vulnerable today more than those who are insulated from the impacts that we're already seeing.
Great. Thank you to both of you for introducing yourselves. We have another important figure in the world conversation about climate coming to Glasgow during COP, Bill McKibben. And I was interested to see that Bill is going to be giving a talk at Glasgow University about older people, about seniors, and about how they can be involved in the conversations around climate and how we respond to the challenges of climate. But I want to begin and end our conversation tonight by thinking a bit about young people. And I thought I would start by asking you, were there people or events or teachers or mentors when you were young that fired your connection to the issues that we're going to be facing during COP26? Or was it something that you encountered and discovered when you were older? So what kind of attitude were you raised with towards these kind of issues? Ruth, can I start with you again?
Sure. So I don't think as I was growing up, there was a whole lot of conversation about climate change itself. The conversation was more about, there were conversations in my family about issues like pollution. I grew up in a very large city, and the cars spewing their exhaust, and fascinating that at one point I was asked in grade school to paint a picture of our city. And I was inspired to it was all gray. I just put the fumes from factories and buses and such. I think I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I had gone to the Britannica Encyclopedia and opened up and read what was already being said about how pollution was contributing to health problems, and there were all these there was all this data. And I remember asking my mom, "Is anybody doing anything about this?" and I couldn't believe that there was so much knowledge and so little action. And my family was very welcoming to these questions, and my mother, before all this drive to get rid of single-use plastic and stuff, she would wash every plastic bag she ever used and went with a cloth bag to the store. And there were certain things that were just kind of built into my growing up experience that made me highly responsible, I guess, from a very young age.
Oh, that's so interesting. And was there anybody making explicit connections between that and faith, between that and Christianity? Were those issues ever talked about at church or talked about in relation to Christian faith for you?
The care of God for a diverse and beautiful creation, and keeping it that way was present. Not as explicitly as I would do it now, or as I have with my own children, but there were some strands of that awareness and of the beauty of creation and the responsibility to care for it.
Thanks so much. So, Katherine, would 13-year-old Katherine Hayhoe have already, were the seeds of being a climate scientist already there for you?
The seeds of being a scientist were there, because I grew up in a family where my father was a science teacher, as well as being a teaching elder in our local church. As we spoke about, we all have roots in the Plymouth Brethren denomination, where you don't have a pastor or a minister, but you have different people who teach. And in fact, my grandmother had a degree in science education.
Wow.
And she used it to educate her 8 children. And she named my father after the first female astrophysicist in Canada. So I grew up with the idea that makes sense when you think about it, but so often we don't hear this, that if we believe that God created this universe that we live in, and we believe the Bible is God's inspired word, then what is science other than studying God's expressed creation? And how could the science and the Bible ever be in conflict with each other, because they come from the same place? So if they appear to be in conflict, I was raised with the idea that it's us. We are the ones who are not interpreting the Bible correctly. We wear very thick cultural glasses, so thick we can't read the words on the page. And Ruth can speak to that, I'm sure, with many examples. And of course, with our science, we're always learning more. So my father is an absolute science enthusiast. One of my earliest memories is going to the park at what felt like 2 a.m. It was probably 9 o'clock at night, and showing me how to find the Andromeda Galaxy through binoculars. And then just a few weeks ago, he was finally able to come visit us the first time after COVID, and he was showing my son how to do the same just a few weeks ago. So I was well on my way to finishing my undergraduate degree in astrophysics, and that's what I was planning on doing with my life, when I needed an extra class to finish my degree. And I looked around, and there was a brand new class on climate science that was being offered for the first time. And I had learned about climate change as a student in high school, along with other environmental issues. So biodiversity loss, deforestation, air pollution, environmental issues that environmentalists worked on. The rest of us wished them well and our bit as reported. But when I took that class, that's where I learned that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it's an everything issue. And what really hit home to me, which spoke directly to my childhood and my values and the teaching that I had received, is that climate change is profoundly unfair. It's a justice issue. It affects the poorest and most marginalized people. And I had been raised with a very strong conviction that we are to do everything we can to help those who are less fortunate than us, with our time, with our effort, with our money, with everything we have. And so for me, that was what absolutely convinced me I had to do everything I could to help. And like you say, I think the seeds of that conviction came from my childhood.
That's so interesting to hear. And actually, it's interesting to hear such good news stories as well, because, I suppose my own story, coming from a somewhat similar background, would not be so positive towards science. And I wonder whether you were aware that although your own immediate families were very supportive and very open in those areas, that there were other people alongside, religious people, who regarded science as more of a threat. I mean, I'm just thinking about, if you think about the contemporary situation in North America, there's a lot of people within religious communities who, on the issue of climate science, are much less open and much less persuaded, and would see that suspicion or that wariness as rooted in their faith, who come from conservative religious backgrounds. Were you aware that although your own families and backgrounds were very supportive and sympathetic, there were other people alongside you who were more wary or more suspicious?
Well, in the community I grew up in, it was more about not being part of the world. So getting an advanced degree, not an undergraduate degree, but an advanced degree, was seen as embedding yourself in the world. Voting was seen as very worldly. So It wasn't anti-science per se. It was more, how much of your time are you going to invest in the world was more the question. But I grew up in Canada. And in the United States, the landscape is very different, because in the United States, since the American Revolution, there have been deliberate and very successful attempts to conflate politics with theology. So the famous Scopes trial back in the early part of the 1900s, the famous Scopes trial over evolution was led by a man who had served as a Secretary of State for the United States, was very afraid of the communist threat and the fascist threat. And so he was actually arguing against evolution from a political standpoint, but he put a religious window dressing on it to make it palatable to everybody. And since then, that path has become well-trodden to the point where today, even here in the US, politicians are putting religiously sounding window dressing. Or icing, so to speak, on the cake of climate denial. And when you cut into that cake, there is nothing there about theology. It is all about politics, identity, ideology, and short-term economic gain. But they put a nice icing of God is in control, so nothing we do can affect the planet, because it sounds pious, it sounds respectable, it sounds good. But again, when you cut into it, there is nothing there to do with anything that we believe as Christians, or in fact, any other major religious tradition.
Ruth, I see you nodding, in agreement, I'm sure. But did you encounter folk as well who, unlike your own family, were much more wary of science and felt it was perhaps a threat to what people?
So, growing up in Argentina in it was a pretty progressive Christian community, really seeking to parse out the essence of the gospel as having to do with the whole of life, with the whole of creation, in a very affirming way. So, Wonderful. And then I was very involved in IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, that was very intentional about, pursuing the study of everything, with very, very free attitude of integrating and saying, God, as Katherine well put it, this is God's creation, this is God's world. Whatever we inquire, whatever knowledge we can acquire and we can use in the disciplines, that just gives us more opportunity to understand the world God created and the way things function. So no, I had a very privileged, I would say, very generous, fertile ground for developing my own thinking and commitments. But I acknowledge that is not the most typical thing, and particularly up in the United States.
Sure, and I would actually echo. I had a very similar experience as a student. The equivalent of IFES in Scotland was hugely encouraging to me intellectually, and I had some really great intellectual and theological mentors. Ruth, can I also ask you, though Katherine just spoke about becoming aware early on that this was a justice issue. And I'm interested to know, as you grew up and studied theology, my understanding of your work is that justice and the relationship between justice and the gospel has been a really important and deep concern for you. When did that start to include concerns about ecology, about the planet, and about people being affected by what was happening to the planet for you?
Yeah, so I think there was just kind of an organic development of becoming more and more aware that if I really believed that God, when I really believed in sovereignty and the lordship of Jesus over all areas of life, it had to encompass how our lifestyle choices, and our lifestyle obviously impacts. It's not just about head knowledge. Theology isn't just something we know. It is something we do. It's something we live. It impacts the way we live. And so it just became kind of organically growing. But I was challenged by some, particularly as I befriended people in the Micah network and then with Arosha. But I was asked at one point to give Micah had a conference back in 2009 on climate change and Christian responsibility, and there were terms like stewardship and such about creation, and so and I was asked to do Bible expositions, and so I was daunted. I was like, how does this theology work? What do I'm not a scientist. I don't know anything about this, but I began to read and to inquire and to just put on those other glasses to read scripture and realize how thoroughly integrated the appreciation for the whole of creation, for the goodness of it, its diversity, its fruitfulness, so much that is poetically already exemplified in Genesis. So then began a much more intentional inquiry and realizing how so many definitions of gospel, of worship, of the end times, so many theological categories have been so reduced when they really have to do with these issues also, and not just with human flourishing, but in human flourishing in relation to the whole of life, the network, the twined relationships that compose our living system that we're a small part of as humans.
That's so fantastic.
It is. That's so interesting, because I didn't realize that we came to this about the same time. And through completely different ways. But so what happened to me was I became a climate scientist, and I was doing everything I could as a scientist, motivated by my heart, but not really explicitly connecting the dots or talking about that. And then I also went to InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is the North American version of the same student group.
Right.
Yeah.
Met my husband there. He turned out to very Brethren tradition, not only teach at a university, but also pastor a local church at the same time. And he started to get so many questions from people in the church about climate change. He said, what can I give them? What resources do you have to give them? And this was, around 2007, 2008. And I said, I don't know. And so I looked, and there was maybe one or two books, but they didn't start where people were at. It started from the premise that people were already concerned, but where we live, people were not concerned. So then he said, well, maybe we should write a book together, and I will outline what we need to say, and then you fill it in because you're the scientist. And so that was the same time. It was the same year.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
And so I had the same thing. I went and I got the Green Bible, and I started to read it. And then I started to realize there were more verses that were not green that I thought even more directly related to what our attitudes and our actions were. So then I started going through the Bible myself with my own highlighter again, and trying to put together the pieces just as you did. But, obviously I'm a scientist, not a theologian, but just getting enough so that I could articulate to people, because I couldn't even articulate to people yet why I, as a Christian, cared. I knew I did, but I couldn't explain it. And I had no verses to use to back myself up.
And I think also connected to that has been the very practical, embedded experience of engaging with. We've been living for many years as part of an intentional Christian community that has taken on just responsible, right relations with the whole of creation as part of our charism, as something we're called into. And so exploring, okay, how does that impact our community lifestyle, our priorities, our values, from everything from just very personal things like recycling our gray waters and having solar panels and composting and then being a bit of a provocation to our neighbors that we can live differently. And what does that, so the inquiry kind of theologically went along with just the lived experience of saying, okay, so what for our personal and community lives.
Katherine, we've kind of we're moving towards Glasgow slowly. We've moved into the next decade, the last decade, I think, with that part of the conversation. And can you tell us about, and maybe we've talked quite a lot about faith already, maybe we could focus on science for a bit. Could you say a little bit about what you think has happened to climate science in the last decade, about the ways in which it has consolidated? Because it feels as though, you were talking about communicating, if you like, some very complex ideas to a wider population. It feels as though that has really begun to happen in the last decade, and that scientists themselves have also mobilized and seen the need to communicate what they were discovering to a wider population.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. So let's start with what has not changed. And what has not changed is the fact that we have known that climate was changing. Humans are responsible for over 100 years. The research was originally done in the 1850s, showing that when we dig up and burn coal back then, and then oil and natural gas today, it produces heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. In the 1890s, scientists were able to calculate by hand, using nothing more than the physics and the chemistry they knew in the 1890s, exactly how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And by the 1930s, scientists had actually detected the warming of the planet due to burning fossil fuels. By the 1960s, well, I should stop in the 1950s, because that's when they first started to do the computerized climate models that won the two physicists the Nobel Prize in Physics earlier this year. And then by the 1960s, scientists were so concerned about the risks of climate change for human populations and human civilization that they formally warned a US president of the dangers of that in 1965. So that's what has not changed. If anything, we know the risks are much greater. What did change over the last 10 years? Well, first of all, back in the 1990s, when I first started studying climate change, it was not politically polarized. In the United States, where it's most polarized, but believe me, it is polarized in the UK and Australia and Canada and even in Europe. It is. And I have the proof because I get attacked every day on social media and I look at where people are from. But even in the United States, in the 1998, 1999, when you asked people what you thought of climate change, you would get the same answer from liberals and conservatives. Maybe concerned, not quite sure. What changed in those 20 years was the fact that the impacts came home to roost. Climate change is no longer a future issue. Wherever we live, our lives are being touched by it today. The biggest way it's affecting us is by what I call loading the weather dice against us. So wherever we live, it's as if we have a pair of dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. A heat wave, a storm, a flood, a drought, a wildfire. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's like it's sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and replacing it with another six and a 7 and another 7. So now our heat waves are more frequent, more extreme. Our heavy downpours are more frequent. Hurricanes and cyclones and typhoons are stronger with a lot more rain. Wildfire is burning greater area in Greece, Alaska, California, and Australia. We're seeing these changes now. And so how does that relate to changing the public discourse? It means that we need to act. And as soon as it became obvious that we had to do something about it, that is when the denial machine swung into action.
Yeah. Because
90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of carbon emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. 90 corporations. 20 are responsible for 1/3 of all carbon emissions since the 1960s.
Yeah.
And so some of them did their calculations, realized it was a lot cheaper to muddy the waters on climate change, taking a leaf out of the playbook of the same companies who had done it for the tobacco industry for so many years, than it would be to change their entire business model. And so that's when the discourse changed. And so through the 2000s, scientists thought very naively, we just tell people the truth. They will realize it's truth if we tell them the data. Here's the temperature data. Here's the data showing the earth is warming. Here's the data showing it's humans. Surely they'll change their things, right? Wrong. But again, around the 2010s, when I was first doing, my communication, I just started a few years before, that's when the social science came in, of understanding how we relate to information, how we process information, how our identities and our tribes often dictate what we believe. We make up our mind first, we go out and justify it afterwards. So the last 10 years, the biggest advance has been in understanding the critical nature of informed, intelligent communication that does not assume that more facts will change people's minds, but that instead looks for where people are, meet them where they are, connect the dots to how they're affected, and offer practical, positive solutions that we can all be part of today.
And so, Ruth, if I can turn to you, I mean, what Katherine's just said connects very strongly in my mind with some of the deep insights that have come from liberation theology, where people have talked about hermeneutics of power and of suspicion. You know, and the tradition I was raised in, I think, wouldn't be very comfortable. They wouldn't think suspicion was necessarily a good Christian attitude to have. But for myself as a theologian, I think that, and someone who comes from a Calvinist tradition, actually, I think a bit of suspicion is pretty important sometimes. I wonder what you think about that in relation to, you know, Katherine's just said about, in a sense, people who were very deliberately in their own interests trying to conceal the consequences of their actions and of all our actions.
Yes, I mean, that critical posture, in some ways, even of some of our theological categories. I mean, if we are told that the gospel just has to do with personal salvation, personal piety, going a ticket to heaven, then of course we will be extremely vulnerable to all the propaganda that is trying to cover up the reality as it is, because it doesn't really matter to us. Because I've got my piece straightened up with God, and the rest doesn't matter. If, on the other hand, we understand the gospel as a whole, much more comprehensive, having to do with a good creation from the very beginning, where every form of life can flourish, then we have to start questioning, is that happening? And if it isn't, why? And what part do we have in allowing that to happen or not? And then what responsibility and what action are we take? If we think of worship to God as just something out there in some little corner on a religious festivity of some sort, be it our Sabbath or our Sunday morning worship or our Friday evening prayer time, and again isolated from our ethical involvement in the world, and we see worship just as, oh, that's the religious piece. Then we're going to say, oh, this doesn't matter again. But if we see concern for our common home as a form of recognition of God, of the God we worship, then we have to take action. So it's so much has to do with how we perceive these theological or religious categories, to what extent we integrate them into the whole of life, or we keep them just kind of sectioned off into some little corner, right? So I think that's part of the challenge at stake here.
That's terrific. It makes me want to ask Katherine, though, seeing your book in the background, you've given your book quite a provocative title for someone who grew up in the Brethren and went to InterVarsity. Surely God's the only one who gets to save us, or Jesus. So tell us about the title and what kind of saving is going on in this book.
Well, you are absolutely right. When we originally came up with the title, I was actually slightly horrified. I thought it might be a bit sacrilegious. So I asked my husband about it. I said, what do you think? Because that's exactly where my mind went, the same place as yours. He said, oh, no, he said, go for it. So in the book, it's very clear, of course, that what I'm talking about is our physical life, our physical existence on this planet. And that's very consistent with what the Bible says, that we have the free will to make choices. And there's consequences to this. The consequences are not the price of sin. The consequences are just, if you step off a cliff, you are going down, because those are the laws of physics. If you dig up and burn fossil fuels, you are producing carbon emissions. They are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping a blanket around the planet. It will warm.
Yeah.
Wildfires will burn greater area. Hurricanes will be stronger. That's just what happens depending on the choices you make. So what the book is really about is the fact that we've been given some amazing gifts from God. And as it says in Timothy, when the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, he says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. And when we see how people react to climate change today, almost every negative reaction we see has its root in fear. This is true for the few people, the very, very few people at the far end of the political spectrum who are determined that it's a hoax.
Yeah.
Why are they so determined it's a hoax? Because they are deathly afraid of what fixing it would look like.
Yeah.
They don't truly have a problem with 200 years of physics. If they did, they wouldn't use stoves or refrigerators. It's the same physics. But they are deathly afraid of what the solutions might look like. And so that manifests it in them as denial. What about the people who are disengaged, who say, oh, that's for those people to worry about. I'm just living my life. Well, they're afraid of what it would look like and how insignificant and helpless they are. So we just metaphorically pull the blankets up over our head and go back to bed when we're faced with a problem that we don't think that we can fix. Fear is at the root of it. Then we've got people now who many people are very worried but feel helpless. And so because of that, we push down our anxiety and we don't talk about it. Whether we are in the UK, whether we are in Canada, the United States, Australia, the majority of people are not talking about it. Because when we talk about it, we just end up depressed and afraid. And then at the very other end of the spectrum, a group that is rapidly growing larger and larger are the people who are so panicked and even often activated, but they're so panicked that they don't think there's anything we can do to fix this. And when you start talking about hope and about choices, they turn on you almost in anger. How dare you suggest that there could possibly be anything better? That it's all over anyways, but I'm just going to be a prophet telling everybody it's done. So all of this has its base in fear. And so to me, significant verses in the whole Bible is in Timothy, where it says, God has not given you a spirit of fear.
Yeah.
When we're reacting out of fear, we know that that's not coming from God. Yeah. But instead, the verse goes on, it says, God has given us a spirit of power, which is, it's a very old-fashioned sounding word, but the way we would say it today is we are empowered. We have agency. We're able to act. Fear paralyzes us, but we have the ability to act. We have the age to act. We have been given a spirit of love. So we act not just out of concern for ourselves, but out of concern for others and for this amazing world that God gave us responsibility over. And as a scientist, the last one's my favorite, a sound mind to make good decisions based on the facts that God's creation are giving to us. So really, that in essence is what the book is about. It's not a book written for Christians per se, but it's written very much from my own perspective as a Christian, that the answer to saving us is not fear.
Yeah.
The answer is power and love and a sound mind.
No, I love the title, and it definitely caught my attention straight away. So, Ruth, I want to ask you about Glasgow, because I'm sitting here in Glasgow, and you're both in North America, and the whole world is coming to Glasgow. And I remember, I'd already begun to, I think, be reasonably well engaged with the issues around concern for the climate and the climate emergency, climate crisis, but then things suddenly took on a different complexion, because there was this announcement that was suddenly made that the whole world was going to come into my city and talk about it. And so suddenly it felt like, as theologian and for us in churches, that maybe God was asking a particular question of us in our city and in bringing COP here. And so we've been trying in various ways over the last couple of years to prepare ourselves for that. Do people that you're talking to, how aware are they about the COP, Ruth? And do you think? And I did hear Trevor Noah saying, I think it's in Scotland somewhere. So he didn't sound very sure where Glasgow was, but the world is about to come to us, and it's an extraordinary feeling. How aware and concerned are the folk that you're mixing with in church and in family circles about COP?
Right. Again, I think I'm somewhat of an exception because I'm embedded in communities that really do care. And so the fact, for example, the last COP that was going to happen in Chile and then went over to Spain, several young people, I was part of a group sending people to participate and engage and preparing and having preparatory conversations across Latin America with indigenous communities and urban young people and such. So I don't think my experience is representative. I think the great majority of people cop what? Yeah. I mean, it's just like, no clue that this is happening, no concern. But I'm grateful, and actually, we're part of Tier Fund, for example, is helping some of the young people that are part of our network to actually be there. A young Kuna indigenous woman that's one of the people I mentor in life. She's going as a delegate from the Kuna Nation in Panama and such. So it's really, we're all very expectant. At the same time, there's this what's really going to come out of it kind of sense, like there is that somewhat of a can't expect it to be the solution. We just hope it can move the dial on some levels of some responsibility on the part of some of the participating nations and movements.
And it's been so difficult, obviously, with the pandemic and the restrictions on travel and around vaccination. And so it's one of the concerns from Tier Fund, Christian Aid, SCIAF, Islamic relief organisations in Scotland have been that voices from the Global South would not be heard as loudly as they might have if we had not had the pandemic in between. Is COP getting coverage in the media where you are, Ruth? When you turn, because here now, when we turn on the TV, it is becoming, every bulletin is something about COP in it. Is it being covered where you are?
No, I haven't really received that much unless I search for it. So I'm also part of a network called Laudato Si of the Catholic climate movement and such. And so there are bulletins coming out all the time. But I realize, again, it's a self-selecting group. It's not representative of what the majority, probably if I talk to any of the neighbors around here, they would not know what I'm talking about.
Okay, that's really interesting. Katherine, you're coming to COP. What does this COP need to do? I mean, what's the agenda for it? And what are climate scientists and campaigners? What's the bottom line in terms of what they are asking this COP to do?
Well, most climate scientists don't go to COP. And in fact, this is only my second one because our job is already done.
Yeah.
We have already assessed the impacts of climate change for a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree warming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 6th assessment report this past August, calling for a code red emergency. And now the climate scientists are sort of sitting there going, let's go. It's time. Not a lot of time left. Still have some time, but not much time. And their conclusions were actually very, very basic and very simple. These are literally the conclusions of the IPCC. Every year matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every action matters and every choice matters. So go forth, governments of the world, and bring your dishes to the global potluck. That's what COP is. It's a global potluck dinner. The world agreed in 2015 in Paris to hold global average temperature to below at least 2 degrees and 1.5 if we can. Neither of those are a magic threshold because some people are already experiencing dangerous impacts today. But the higher we go, the greater the risk of widespread and continuous dangerous impacts. It's sort of like smoking cigarettes. There's no magic number of cigarettes, but the more you smoke, the greater the risks. So that's what the world agreed. But then it's up to every country to determine what they bring to the table. One country might be investing in afforestation, another in smart agriculture, another in efficiency, another in electric cars, another in phasing out coal, another in a price on carbon, like my home country of Canada. So every country brings its dish to the global potluck. And right now, we don't have enough food on the table. There's only enough food on the table to keep warming below 2.7 degrees with a 66% chance of that happening. And that is not good enough. So the COP meetings are a chance for each country to bring their dish, and everybody else sees who brought the big fresh apple pie that when you cut into it is full of hot air. Who brought the single fish finger from the back of the freezer that has been sitting there for a year?
Yeah.
Who brought the fresh pasta salad with vegetables and homemade dressing and homemade bread? There are a few countries bringing that.
Yeah.
Countries like Nepal and the Gambia, Costa Rica also. And so that's what COP is about. So what would a success look like? A success would look like leaving COP with the ambition of those countries increased, such that everybody had promised to bring a dish that would fulfill their obligations. That's what a success would look like.
Ruth, Costa Rica got a shout out there, which I'm sure you'll be pleased about, and in terms of what they're
proud of.
I mentioned that I live very close to the COP site, and I walk my dog down towards the River Clyde, and COP, you will see that in all the world's TV channels when they cover COP, the river that flows through the centre of Glasgow. And there's one place where Extinction Rebellion, the climate pressure group, have put some posters up. And I've walked past them a lot of times in the last few weeks. And the poster reads, "Act now." And you think it's going to say "before it's too late," but then "before" is scored out with a line through it, and it says "because it's too late." And I suppose as somebody who teaches, and I have teenage kids myself, but I also spend a lot of time teaching students. I've been thinking a lot about that. That's a tough thing, I think, for young people to hold, both the call to action and also this sense of because it's too late. Now, maybe Katherine will tell us in a moment it's not too late, but that's an interesting message and a complicated message. And I wonder whether you could say something about hope, about how you think people hold on to hope in a situation where there is a lot of fear around. And I think amongst some of these are some of the most committed young activists who are doing everything already they can, putting their bodies on the line, and yet they've got this fear that it is too late. And I wonder, what would you say to the person who made that poster?
Well, I did love Katherine's fantastic expose about the issue of fear, right? On the one hand, I think crossing it out and saying because it is too late is just saying basically what does need to be heard is this is not something that can wait. This cannot be left to the next generation. This is something that needs to be addressed years ago, but at least now. And so that sense of urgency and the graphic impact of the crossing out the word and putting because instead of before, I think it has a daring prophetic needed. The world needs to name, needs to acknowledge. Otherwise, and there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is a shallow response that often is just because we're not even confronting reality. And the world does need to confront reality, and we need to take responsibility for it. So in some ways, I think that boldness is welcome. At the same time, we cannot be captivated by hopelessness, desperation, and that sense of fear. There are things that every little bit makes a difference. The way we live as individuals, as families, as communities, as countries, as the planet itself together. There are things that can be done. And so letting go of hope would just be going down, even down into worse conditions. And the reality, as Katherine was saying, is there already are so many millions of people affected by the current condition. We cannot allow it to continue. And hope, where do we get hope? I mean, I do, as a believer in the story of God's good creation and recreation of all things, I do have hope that things can be restored in God's good time. But that doesn't get me off the hook of being part of the solution right now, of being active and engaged and committed right now, because I don't know when or how any of that is going to happen. What I do know is that we can make a difference today. And so to me, there's the hope that generates committed action together. I am not going to save the world individually. This is something that we have to come to agreements and to lifestyle changes as communities.
Katherine, you probably understand the threat in much more detail and depth than I do, and yet you still seem to be hopeful. How would you address this question about hope and speak to the young protesters who put those posters up?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because we scientists who study this, and I study the difference our choices make. I'm actually somebody who generates high resolution climate projections, and I look at the impact they have on corn yields in Uzbekistan and flooding in India, and extreme heat and wildfires in North America. And when I look at this, as Ruth said, hope begins in a dark place. Hope begins, the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans, hope begins with suffering. And suffering leads to perseverance, and perseverance leads to character, and character to hope that will not disappoint. And here's a really interesting aspect for many people who would call themselves Christians. We say, well, our hope is ultimately placed in this world this world is temporal, and we will go on to something better. That's not what the Apostle Paul says. Hope is based on the love that God has poured out in our hearts. And so love is really the key that unlocks our hope. Love of people, love of place, love of things. Why do we fight? It's because we're passionate for what we love. We love justice. We love people. We love our sisters and our brothers, and we love this incredible planet that God gave us responsibility over. And so when people are hopeless, it's so hard. I mean, it's almost easier to talk to people who are disengaged than people who are hopeless. And I just had somebody ask me today recently about the political situation in the United States, with a single person holding up the most meaningful piece of climate legislation the United States has seen in 10 years. How do you find hope? You don't find hope by pinning it on a person or a piece of legislation or a government or a prime minister or a president, because an individual act or person or event will always disappoint. But when we look around, when we broaden our gaze to look at all of the people, all of the cities, all of the corporations, all of the churches who are acting, all of the organizations, we see that climate action is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an incredibly steep hill with a few people's hands on it and only one chance to get it up. Rather, that boulder is already at the top of the hill, and it already is rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it already has millions of hands on it. It just isn't going fast enough. So when we add our hands, it will go a little faster. When we use our voice, when we use our sphere of influence to encourage our school, our university, our neighborhood, our city, our church, our organization to also put their hands on it, it goes even faster. To quote Greta Thunberg, who I think knows more about action than most people 10 times her age, not 10 times, 5 times. To quote Greta Thunberg, she says, the one thing we need more than hope is action. But when we act, hope is all around us because we see people acting out of love, sometimes out of fear, but then the fear can show us that it can activate us and show us that there are other people acting. So don't pin your hope on one person, one thing, one government, one piece of legislation. Recognize rather that there are many people rolling that boulder down the hill, and practice active hope. We go out and we look for reasons to be hopeful. These days, hope will not find you if you just kind of sit there. But if you go out and look for it, it is all around us. And then you know what we can do? We can share it.
So I'm going to tell people tomorrow that I had a conversation late last night with Katherine Hayhoe and Ruth Padilla DeBorst about COP and climate change and the challenges we faced. But we ended up talking about hope and about love and about action. And I'm so grateful to both of you for giving up your time to be part of this conversation. And thank you very, very much for doing that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Katherine. Learn as always from you.
The same.